Cathy Ford answers a seemingly normal phone call on February 17th, 1988. What she doesn't know is that this phone call will have deadly consequences. No one in the town of Gorman expects something like this to happen in their community. This is the last time anyone will ever see Cathy Ford. Gorman, Maryland borders the sister town of Gormania across the Potomac River in West Virginia. Both towns are the quintessential American small towns, with 106 people living in Gorman and 133 in Gormania. Gorman is a safe haven for the community, named after former United States Senator Arthur B. Gorman. The majority of work in Gorman is in the mining industry. Events and attractions like the annual canoe races and golden trout festivals bring life into the small community. It's 1988, and the local hotspot is a local restaurant owned by the Ford family. Richard and Rosalie Ford moved their family of 6 from Wilmington, Delaware to the community of Gorman in 1984. It's been a successful venture for Richard and Rosalie. Business is great, and their children have flourished in Gorman, one of which is their 19-year-old daughter, Cathy, who still works with them at the restaurant. Cathy is a bright light in this town. Locals describe her as nice, well-liked, and sensible. Since the move, Cathy has found romance in the form of Darvin Moon, her boyfriend of 3 years.
Cathy Ford was probably a typical teenager. Then she fell in love with Darvin Moon, who was, I think, a few years older. And so she got into a relationship with him, and her whole world was right there in Gorman in that restaurant, her family.
One of the locals includes former Army veteran and newly promoted Deputy Sheriff of Grant County, Paul Farrell. Paul attended Southern High School, where he's the star athlete, excelling in boxing and basketball. Paul still helps his parents at their country store, which is across the river in the twin town of Gorman. He also has a trailer near the Stony River he visits from time to time. Cathy and Paul have bonded considerably since she moved to Gorman. Cathy wants to do bigger and better things, despite being trapped in Gorman because she has to help with the restaurant. Paul is sympathetic and a great companion to vent to. While both are in separate relationships, it is clear that they have a great connection.
She expressed a lot of desire to get out of it, but she was kind of trapped.
February 17th, 1988 begins like any other day. Cathy arrives at work, makes a pot of coffee, and prepares the restaurant for the day. As the morning goes on, something strange happens. A man, claiming to be a magistrate at Mount Storm in Grant County, calls and asks Cathy to meet him at 3 p.m. to answer some questions about some checks from the restaurant. He explains he believes they are dealing with check fraud. At around 1 p.m., the phone rings again. On the phone is an undercover cop. He informs Cathy that they are investigating the restaurant's liquor license. Several businesses in the area have been recently shut down for selling alcohol to minors. Cathy tells her mom to make sure she IDs every guest because of the call she just received. Her mother asks her who called. Cathy refuses to say. When pressured further by her mother, Cathy responds, "No, he'll lose his job." Cathy's shift is over. She leaves the restaurant to go home. Her mother asks Cathy where she is going repeatedly, but Cathy won't say.
Cathy leaves in a hurry, but she says she'll be back shortly.
Cathy received a phone call that day, and she answered it, and this other waitress, Pat Parker, she could hear the conversation, or at least Cathy's part of it, and Cathy finally said, "Who is this?" And so whoever it was told her some more, and then she hung up and told them that she had to go meet somebody.
Cathy returns to the restaurant around 2 p.m. in her father's car.
So she went over to her apartment and came back much better dressed. And they thought, well, that's kind of strange.
Pat asks where she's going, but Cathy again won't say. This is the last time Pat, or any of her family or loved ones, see Cathy alive.
Cathy's relative who said she saw her Ford Bronco going north. That was the last anybody saw her.
When Cathy doesn't return home, her parents report her disappearance to the police.
For her parents to report her missing, even after only a few hours of not coming home, tells me that this is something unusual.
At 8:30 p.m., Paul Farrell joins his friends at a local bowling alley.
He drove up to Oakland to play in a bowling league that night, and all of a sudden he got a phone call. And it was Cathy. And she sounded very afraid. She said, "Darvin found out something about me." And I don't know if it was about her and Paul or something. And she said, "I have to meet with you right away." Paul went back into the bowling alley and announced that he had to leave. And his teammates weren't real happy with that. But the bowling alley owner confirmed that he all of a sudden just said, "Hey, I gotta go." He agreed to meet her at, I think, a school parking lot. So when he got there, nobody was there. So I thought, well, that's really weird. According to him, she wanted to get rid of Darvin Moon. She was terrified. She had told some people she was afraid he was going to kill her because he had a horrific temper, apparently.
Paul waits for 20 minutes, but Cathy never arrives. Paul is shocked when he hears Cathy's disappeared. He has no idea she's reported missing earlier that night. A young woman has been taken. The thought that it's someone in the community haunts the public. The people of Gorman will have to live with these feelings for now because they need to focus on finding Cathy Ford. The day after Cathy's disappearance, the Ford's restaurant has now become ground zero for the search. Though distraught, Cathy's parents, Richard and Rosalie, are putting on brave faces. What matters most is finding Cathy. Along the tree line of Highway 50, local residents search for Cathy. Leading the search party, along with Officer Smith, is Paul Farrell. As a local resident and a deputy sheriff, he is trusted with the task. The Ford family feels they are in good hands with him, as he is well known and respected in the community.
Investigators who live and are from a small town often are more intimately aware of the environment. They know the people very well. They know the places that kids go and hide. They know all the nooks and crannies associated with that community. It's a luxury almost to have people in your law enforcement agency who are from that community.
2 days later, on February 20th, Paul's girlfriend, Cathy Barnard, asks if he's heard about Cathy Ford's disappearance. Paul is aware that Cathy is missing. He's concerned people suspect he has something to do with it. Cathy's car is last seen headed towards Mount Storm, where his trailer is located.
A guy named James Kuhn, who testified he was driving up the road and Cathy Ford was in front of him in her Ford Bronco. And this was on the day that she disappeared. And he saw her turn on to, I think it's Bismarck Road, which is the road that Paul's trailer was on. And so that was the last anybody supposedly saw her.
While cleaning up around his trailer, Cathy Barnard finds a note in one of Paul's pairs of pants. The note depicts two people setting up restaurants to sell alcohol to minors by using fake IDs. When Cathy questions him, Paul is concerned that someone around town is getting businesses to sell to minors. On February 26th, Paul and Officer Smith meet with Vonda Moreland, a concerned citizen, who wishes to assemble an official search committee. Both officers think it's a great idea. It's been 9 days since Cathy disappeared, and a dedicated search party would be very helpful. A young woman approaches Officer Smith. She describes a disturbing event that happens to her on the day of Cathy Ford's disappearance. Paul heads back to his trailer for lunch, where he discovers startling new information about the case. Then, he sees something off in the distance. Gorman, Maryland borders the sister town of Gormania, across the Potomac River in West Virginia. Both towns are the quintessential American small towns, with 106 people living in Gorman and 133 in Gormania. These small towns are rocked by the tragic disappearance of 19-year-old Cathy Ford, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Members of the town have rallied together to search for Cathy Ford. Paul Farrell is leading the search for Cathy, while also investigating the nature of her disappearance. The investigation is at a standstill, but when the police receive new information and Paul Farrell sees something that shocks him, the case is starting to heat up. Paul calls Vonda Moreland, asking if they can put a hold on the search for 48 hours, but she's unable to call off the search. Paul also requests that Bismarck and Cherry Roads be exempt from the search because evidence has been found near the intersection and he doesn't want it contaminated. And then a potential break in the case. A young woman around the same age as Cathy Ford tells the police about a phone call she receives the morning of Cathy Ford's disappearance. The man claims to be a magistrate and says he is conducting an investigation into someone she knows, telling her she needs to meet him at the Mount Storm Fire Hall to discuss it. When confronted about who he's investigating, the man becomes defensive and quickly ends the call. It turns out several women receive calls like this, all from a man claiming to be a magistrate.
They're two very distinctive sets of phone calls that are made. However, the recipients in all of them are women between the ages of 19 and 39. The first set of calls takes place between September 28, 1987 and the end of November of 1987. The recipients are all asked to meet at a location near Bayard Wilson Corona Road. The second set of calls takes place between February 1st, 1988 and the day that Cathy Ford disappeared. The circumstances are identical except the women are all asked to meet near Bismarck Road.
The number of women had been receiving phone calls. Nobody was ever hurt. They were just pranks.
The residents of Gorman are afraid of the new threat in their peaceful community.
The residents are nervous, and essentially they're hiding inside from a threat that really only revealed itself when Cathy Ford didn't return home.
Some optimistic evidence is delivered in the form of a letter on March 2nd, 1988. 14 days after Cathy's disappearance, the letter is addressed to Cathy's parents, Rosalie and Richard Ford Jr. The letter reads, "The only crime here is we had to get rid of the old man's Bronco right away. Cathy is 19, an adult, and we had to leave fast. We came into some dangerous money, so here is some money on the Bronco. More to follow. She'll call you when she feels it's safe to do so. We're heading where I can get work. Cathy made me write to you so you wouldn't worry. She had to get away from Darvin Moon, the restaurant, and certain people. We keep the money, her green bag. Tell Moon to leave us alone." Included in the envelope is $200 in $20 bills. Evidence continues to pile up on March 8th when the police find out that smoke hangs over Stony River on the day of Cathy Ford's disappearance. A burnt car is found in a remote wooded area just outside of Stony River.
If there's no body, there is no medical examiner investigators. We work with the police and specialists for cause and manner of death. And so in this case, I can't imagine the individuals in search for evidence and suspected arson occurred and has destroyed all of the evidence that may have been contained within the vehicle that the victim owned. The power of heat will congeal everything together, and sometimes you can't even determine if it was a part of a car or was that evidence. As the forensic investigation team obtained that burnt out vehicle as evidence, I mean, they would have found the remains of a human and bones, or teeth for that matter, anything, if the victim was present within her vehicle. But she definitely was not in the vehicle at the time.
The car is found 100 yards from Paul Farrell's trailer, beside Bismarck and Cherry Road. Police immediately notice bloodstains in the trailer. Paul's questioned about the evidence against him. Paul denies hurting Cathy Ford in any way, but does confess that the two of them had a secret affair for several years. Paul is arrested on March 20th, 1988. He is kept in a cell until March 25th, when he is freed on a bail of $100 until he faces trial. On February 17, 1988, in the small community of Gorman, Maryland, Cathy Ford leaves town to meet someone and never returns. The police have identified their prime suspect, Paul Farrell. Paul is a deputy sheriff in Grant County, where Gorman resides. He's also a local at the restaurant owned and operated by Cathy's family and where she currently works. When questioned, he reveals that he and Cathy have been having a secret affair for a number of years. The motive is unclear, but the evidence against Paul Farrell is hard to ignore. Paul is linked to various phone calls made to young, attractive females, seemingly with the attempt to lure them to two specific locations. Paul rents trailers in both locations when the calls are made. The car Cathy Ford is last seen driving is found burnt 100 yards from Paul's trailer, an area he asks to not be searched. The police search Paul's trailer. They find bloodstains in the bedroom, installation of new carpeting, and fresh paint. Paul Farrell is arrested, and on January 25, 1989, his trial begins. Paul Farrell is being charged with kidnapping, second-degree murder, and third-degree arson. Paul pleads not guilty to all charges.
In this case, there's no body and there's no murder weapon. So not only is it going to be a challenge for the prosecution to show that Paul Farrell is the one who committed this crime, but that the crimes that they're alleging even occurred in the first place. So what they're gonna have to do is try to gather all of the evidence that they can in absence of this direct evidence. So relying heavily on circumstantial evidence to prove to the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that Paul Farrell is guilty. What they're gonna have to do, in addition to gathering that evidence, is also try to prove a motive and show evidence that Paul Farrell disposed of Cathy Ford's body in the way that they're alleging he did.
The prosecutor addresses the jury and delivers his opening arguments. He states that Paul uses fraud to entice Ms. Ford to meet with him in order to gain a sexual concession. And that when Paul is unable to get what he wants, he kills Cathy Ford, disposes of her body, and burns the car to eliminate evidence. The prosecution present various phone calls to lure young women. In many of the phone calls, the man claims to be a magistrate. Both magistrates in the county are female. One of the magistrates and her assistant testify that Paul Farrell uses a payphone outside of their building between 10 and 11 in the morning of February 17th, 1988. The prosecution present evidence of 206 additional phone calls to libraries and bookstores across the country. During these calls, Paul Farrell poses as a doctor and asks young female employees to read sexually explicit pages from the book Our Bodies, Ourselves. One employee hears heavy breathing on the other end of the phone while she reads. The prosecution states Paul is making these phone calls as a way of self-gratification. The defense admits to Paul making these calls. For him, it's like calling a sex hotline without having to pay. Paul says this evidence should be excluded because it's more prejudicial than probative.
So circumstantial evidence is evidence that speaks to the surrounding circumstances of a crime but doesn't necessarily tie a suspect directly to it. Suspicious phone calls, being in the wrong place at the wrong time are things that create an error that lead one to believe that this person committed the offense, but doesn't necessarily directly tie them to it and could potentially have another very plausible explanation. Direct evidence, on the other hand, is direct links between the accused and the crime. So things like DNA, a confession, fingerprints, that hard evidence that tends to be much easier for a jury to believe than a case that's purely based on circumstantial evidence. Prejudicial evidence is used to create a negative image of the accused, whereas probative evidence is evidence that speaks directly to the facts of the case. So in this situation, what Paul Farrell is trying to argue is that the phone calls that were made are prejudicial as opposed to probative. So what a judge needs to determine in determining whether that evidence should be admissible is whether the probative effects of that evidence, so the direct links to the case that they're considering, outweigh the potential prejudicial effects of that evidence. In this case, what the prosecution is using those phone calls to libraries and bookstores to establish is a motive to commit the specific offense that he's on trial for. So where normally they would be considered more probative than prejudicial, in this case, the prosecution is using them to draw a direct link to the case at bar.
The number of women had been receiving phone calls. Nobody was ever hurt. They were just pranks. It all ended up that Paul Farrell was accused of making these calls. They had no proof of this. They had all these women testify. One, after a lot of pressure, said that the caller sounded like Paul Farrell, which she later recanted, said she told them, no, I don't think so. And he said, you gotta stick to your story that you gave us. You've gotta say that it was Paul Farrell. They started a very concerted effort of assassinating Paul Farrell's character. A lot of these women who were involved, they're kind of sheltered up in the mountains. The deputies and even the FBI and the prosecutors started telling them horror stories about Paul Farrell, that he had been implicated in 9 rapes and murders when he worked out at Yellowstone Park. They were telling them all kinds of stories to make Paul look like a very dangerous psychopath based on no evidence whatsoever.
Cathy Barnard testifies that on February 29, 1988, she receives a phone call from Paul, who is in Pennsylvania.
Paul started getting implicated, and eventually he became afraid, so he did some stupid things. And one thing he did was drive up into Pennsylvania and mail a letter to Cathy's mom, handwritten letter that just said, Dear Mom, I'm okay, I just had to get away. Here's some money to help with everything. So he mailed it. And by that point, Paul was a very strong suspect. So when the mother got that letter, they tried to figure out who that call came from. And they got the phone records from the pay booth. At that time, in that small town, a call was made to Paul's girlfriend. So that did not look good at all. And I've seen this in a number of cases that people become very afraid when they realize they're a suspect and sometimes do stupid things that actually digs them into a bigger hole. And that's what Paul did.
Paul admits to making the call to Cathy Barnard, and the prosecution is ready to pounce. But could he have another reason for this suspicious behavior? On February 17, 1988, in the small community of Gorman, Maryland, one of its citizens, Cathy Ford, is missing. The car Cathy Ford is last seen driving is found burnt 100 yards from Paul Farrell's trailer. Paul Farrell is being charged with kidnapping, second-degree murder, and third-degree arson. The State versus Farrell trial is underway. The prosecution has provided the jury with two key pieces of evidence. The first are the phone calls Paul Farrell makes to young women, luring them into a remote location or asking them to read a sexual passage from a book. The second is the letter addressed to Cathy Ford's parents. The letter's in Paul Farrell's handwriting, along with the same amount of money Paul took out of his bank account days before. A burnt car is found behind Paul Farrell's trailer in an area he asked not to be searched. The car is set on fire intentionally and can be accessed by Paul without traveling on any main roads. The prosecution concludes that after Paul Farrell kills Cathy Ford, he drives the car away from his trailer and sets it on fire to destroy the evidence.
From what I could tell and what many people told me about Paul, and I think a psychological evaluation even showed this, that Paul has very low mechanical aptitude. They said he was a mechanical klutz. You know, he barely knew how to open a car hood, let alone figure out what to do inside. That's what I was told by a lot of people. They said if Paul had tried to set fire to that Bronco, he would have burned himself up with it because he was just such a klutz.
Paul Farrell admits asking to stop the search where the car is located is a mistake. He says he is trying to stop the discovery of the car. He knows that it would look very incriminating if it is found in his backyard. The prosecution provides the jury with evidence found in Paul Farrell's trailer. The police also find a cigarette butt and a watch. The cigarette butt is from the brand that Cathy Ford smokes. The watch is hers too.
The blood test in this case came back inconclusive, which isn't a huge deal because when they can present evidence that there was blood alongside the other evidence, even if there's no conclusive evidence that that blood belonged to Cathy Ford, it may still be enough to persuade a jury. If you're the defense, however, you definitely want this evidence to be excluded because you want as little evidence as possible. In this case, the judge determined that the blood was admissible evidence.
They didn't have Cathy Ford's blood type, so it was all speculation to begin with, let alone any genetic evidence of her blood or anything.
A neighbor testifies that between 1 and 2 p.m., she hears terrifying screams and a gunshot coming from Paul Farrell's trailer. The next day, she witnesses Paul Farrell taking carpet out of his trailer. She asks why he is replacing the carpet. Paul responds that it's because of a dark stain and animal odor. Both Cathy Barnard and Paul's landlord were inside his trailer prior to February 18th. Neither of them notice any dark stains or animal odor.
The most crucial of whom was the woman who lived closest to Paul Farrell's trailer. And she testified at trial that she heard some banging, then she heard a scream, and then gunshots coming from Paul's trailer, and later she saw smoke. And finally her husband slapped the table and said, "Damn it, woman, I don't know if you're going to tell the truth, but I am." So then he went into the story of how they terrified her, they kept coming back to her, they kept threatening her, that they would take their children from her. So she broke. So she agreed to sign a statement saying what she testified to. But she immediately tried to take it back. And they told her, "You can't take it back. If you don't say this at trial, we're going to charge you with perjury. And we'll take away your kids."
The prosecution presents body language analysis before and after he completes a polygraph test.
I always tell people I'm trying to help, do not take a polygraph exam. one way or the other, they'll use it against you. If you take it and pass, they'll say, oh, okay, we still think you're guilty. And there have been a lot of innocent people convicted, in part because they made the mistake of taking a polygraph exam. In most states, polygraph exams are not admissible for good reason, because they've never been scientifically proven to be accurate, and most of the evidence points in the other direction.
The analyst states that he reads Paul Farrell 2 scenarios in which Paul meets with Cathy Ford. In the first, their meeting is pleasant and peaceful. In the second, Paul acts aggressive and violent, saying that while he reads the second scenario, Paul is nodding, understanding this to be an admission of guilt.
Paul's shown to be nodding, and that could actually be interpreted a number of ways and not necessarily as an admission of guilt. For example, it could just be Paul indicating that he understands the question that he's being asked.
This FBI agent, what he testified about specifically was Paul Farrell's body language. And this was supposedly, according to the attorneys, the first time in America that body language was allowed as expert testimony.
Most often, in order to obtain a conviction for murder, officers or investigators need to provide a body, a victim. But a jury can still reach a conclusion that a person is guilty of a homicide in the absence of that evidence.
Cathy Ford's body is still not found.
Could be no body because she's alive. That's an extreme long shot. If Paul is telling the truth about Cathy calling him in a panic and already being depressed and thinking about she wanted to be someplace else. There is a phenomenon called the fugue state. The fugue state is when a person, particularly at a time of stress, goes into a panic and disappears. And sometimes they come back within a few days, sometimes a few weeks, sometimes never. They set up a new identity and just disappear. Whether she would do that, I don't know, but her letters certainly showed she was a very, very unhappy person. She felt trapped by Darvin Moon. According to a lot of people, it was a violent, abusive relationship. She expressed a lot of desire to get out of it, but she was afraid. She felt trapped by her parents' restaurant, which she was expected to work in. She was trapped in this remote, depressing area. And so there were reasons for her to disappear.
In December of 1989, Cathy Ford is allegedly seen alive. A couple from Gorman are passing through Nashville when they think they see Cathy Ford entering a restaurant, dressed as a waitress. The couple say that Cathy met their glance and when doing so immediately ran to the back of the restaurant.
Yeah, is it one of those one-offs where people say that you always have a twin and they found that twin? Or is it where she just never wanted to be found and that's why she's gone missing? Them feeling they wanted to find her and then your mind can play tricks on you saying, you know what, I think that was her. It looked like her. But it was never proven to be her.
Richard and Rosalie Ford are both skeptical that Cathy is alive. They believe that she will contact them if she is. If Cathy Ford is alive, what motive could there be to leave Gorman and not contact her family? Maybe this is just her ticket out of the small town. Then again, she always says she wants to do bigger and better things. Paul Farrell is found guilty of kidnapping, third-degree arson, and second-degree murder. He is sentenced to life imprisonment with mercy. The Ford family feels justice is served. They continue their lives with a weight off their shoulders. Cathy's killer is behind bars, and her family finds solace. The dust settles, and life goes back to normal in Gorman. The threat that keeps many residents in their homes is gone, and the town takes a collective sigh of relief. Paul Farrell is behind bars, but many still believe he's innocent.
And I got a copy of his prison intake psychological evaluation, and the psychologist remarked that he had none of the pathology that he would expect to see in a convicted killer. And then his attorney later had a forensic psychologist who did forensic psychological analyses for the CIA. So he was very respected and top-notch. And so he put Paul through a lot of tests and interviewed him in depth. And he said, I would be amazed that Paul Farrell could do something like this. He pointed out reasons why, and that he just didn't fit. But there he was in prison for murder. And yeah, some people are good actors, but Paul's not that way. He wears his emotions on his sleeves.
In 1990, Paul appeals his conviction to the West Virginia Supreme Court. His appeal is denied by a 3-2 vote. In 2001, West Virginia Governor Cecil Underwood commutes Paul Farrell's sentence. The order states that Paul Farrell's convictions are not supported by a body, a weapon, physical evidence, or eyewitness testimony. This grants Paul Farrell parole in 2002.
And the governor went through all the evidence that raised doubts about Paul's conviction. On his last day in office, granted Paul clemency.
Commuting a sentence means that they're not necessarily overturning the conviction and saying that that person didn't do it, but they're allowing them to serve the rest of their jail sentence in the community.
In May 2004, the parole board grants Paul Farrell's release after serving 18 years.
This case is replete with outrageous misconduct, and as I still look back at it, it's one of the most outrageous cases I've ever investigated in 30 years of doing this work. Nothing like this. The character assassination, feeding the rumor mill, distorting the evidence, ignoring evidence pointing in other directions.
Some people on the scene have noticed that the grass and trees have not been affected by the burning of the vehicle. And that's led to speculation that perhaps it was burnt somewhere else and somehow transported to this location.
They had no evidence against Paul. Nothing was found that linked Cathy Ford to his trailer. No fingerprints. The blood testimony was bogus. There was no gun, no gunshot residue, nothing. Originally, when he got out, the case was still very notorious. He had time building himself back into society.
Paul currently resides in Gorman and maintains his innocence. Cathy Ford's body has still not been found.